Greetings as we come to the sixth Sunday of the year. And our readings this time, the first reading comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and verses 44 through 46. The second reading comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 31 through chapter 11, verse 1. So it's the rest of chapter 10 and then the beginning of chapter 11. And finally, the gospel is from, again, Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. All right, now we have been listening over the last couple of weeks to stories. Remember that, as we have mentioned before, as Mark presents his gospel, he sees the inauguration of Jesus' mission as taking place in a grand week. And so this time we come to the conclusion of that. A little bit of background as we begin to analyze the readings suggested for this week. In the year 1868, the Norwegian scientist Gerhard Hansen discovered the biomedical cause of leprosy, which is an extremely chronic but not very infectious disease. He was praised, and basically, rather, it is caused by the loss of sensation and a progressive development of the extremities or hurting of the extremities of a person's body, but usually is a painless ulceration. Now, I give this little background because, as we have noticed on other occasions, that when the scripture, and this is the story, by the way, just to kind of flesh this out, where Jesus is pictured as curing a man who is suffering leprosy. And as we have pointed out before, the leprosy that really is being described in the New Testament or in the time of first century or Mediterranean world was not basically Hansen's disease. It did exist, and we know from some writing that goes back to the days of Alexander the Great, the Greek, that would be about 300 years prior to Jesus' time, that Hansen's disease was known and apparently had been brought in from Asia, from the east, as it moved west. But pretty much it did not really affect much of the Mediterranean world in the time frame that the Gospels were written. However, and so where do we begin? Well, let's begin a little bit with the fact that Jesus, of course, is approached by a man who is known as leprosy, and at one point kind of says to Jesus, "If you can, would you please cure me of this illness?" And the response that Jesus kind of quips back is, "If I can," but then admires the man's faith and sends him off to the priests to test whether or not he has truly been cured. All right, that is, in summary, the gospel passage. The book of Leviticus, which is the first reading, deals with what to do if one is determined to have leprosy. Now, was it contagious? Well, we now know that it wasn't contagious. That is, if you touch someone who had so-called leprosy, you would not also receive it yourself. So in that sense, it's not passed on by touch. So what is the issue here? What is the concern? The concern is that it renders one impure. Now, it has to do with religious ceremonies, with religious rites. Obviously, this I call it a disease, but is it really an affliction? And it wasn't necessarily permanent. See, as we have noticed on other occasions, it isn't leprosy was seen as any skin disease. Could be pus. It could be, as I think, kind of smile and say, could be teenage, problem too. Those things would pass. But the concern is that it made one unclean. Why? Because there's the phrase and the teaching that we find in the scripture, be holy as the Lord is holy. That's found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. Now, again, we may have mentioned on other occasions, the book of Leviticus is the fourth of the five great books. Is the third of the five great books that make up what's known as the Pentateuch. In fact, the book of Leviticus sits in the middle of these five books. To one side is Genesis and Exodus. On the other side is Numbers and Deuteronomy. And in the center, and Leviticus, we believe, was basically written by, now we could argue, by written do I mean someone took a pen or a stylus and wrote it down, or is the material in that book basically the result of a group who are known as the priests? Now, the priestly group gains great importance after the period of what is known as the exile. And that would be sometime after approximately the year 500 before the common time. And because the priestly group, at least by the theory that is still supported by many, although even in some quarters there is a challenging of this, but the priestly group is one of four contributing ways of thinking, I was going to say theology, that predominate in the Pentateuchal tradition. We believe, would have been the last of those contributing to the material that's found in the the Pentateuch, or what are called the books of Moses that we just mentioned. And obviously, the writers who have the last input into how the material is organized have a way of kind of supporting what they believe was the most important. So the book of Leviticus is basically about religious practices and customs. And you can see why the priest would put that book in the center, nicely kind of affected the other books, the other works, and gave importance to how Israel was to live its life. And in fact, in the book of Leviticus are found the holiness codes, which are a retelling of the commandments told in both Exodus and Deuteronomy. So you see where I'm going here is the importance that really is rendered by the priestly group in terms of proper worship, proper taking part in the sacred kind of things. So, what and the priestly group was very, very powerful. By the way, when the Babylonian captivity had ended, as I mentioned, Ezra, who has a book and a title named after him, was the priest. See, so this is what I'm saying is that the priestly group comes to kind of determining how the Israelites, particularly those who returned from the exile and came back to the land of Israel, should be living their lives. So for this reason, they saw Israel's exile, so they'll give a reason why the exile had happened, was a failure to keep itself pure and holy. So see where I'm going here. These purity laws, these holiness laws are very much a concern of the priestly group. In fact, just as a kind of an aside here, as we're examining a little bit the Levitical tradition or understanding, the priests, when the returned people from exile came, and not everyone had left, and some had left there, the priests were arguing that men who married non-Jews should be divorcing their wife. In fact, that this intermarriage had caused impurity to happen, and so therefore they argued against what we would call mixed marriages. Mixed marriages here meaning having cultural differences should be broken up so that the purity of the nation would be restored. Therefore, they argued there should be avoidance of any relationship with foreigners. This brought about contamination, and therefore it was wrong. So the argument was that a person was not holy as the Lord your God is holy if you are polluting it by some unclean practices. Now all of that is a little bit of a background, but if one would be suffering from, again, some skin ailments, here's what the book of Leviticus says. For no one who has a blemish may draw near, a man blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face, or a limb too long, or a man with an injured foot, or an injured hand, or a hunchback, or a dwarf, or a man with a defect in his sight, or an itching disease, or scales, or cracked testicles. All of those were considered to render a man impure. And the result was he must live alone, his dwelling must be outside the camp. Again, this is found in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 46. So the next verse from the one that we are hearing this weekend. It gives some indication on what one should wear. So a person afflicted like this should wear torn clothes, should let his hair grow, never go to the barber. And in fact, his hair should be disheveled so that it looks, I have to smile that there are some today who like this style, but this was imposed on them. And that they should cover their upper lip and cry out from behind it, unclean, unclean. So notice that the directions are pretty explicit. Who were rendered in this position, what and how they should act. And another tradition was that they were to carry a little bell to ring if you were coming near people. I think we used the adage, should keep the distance of a 10-foot pole. Well, literally, that was what was considered. Now again, this is not a question of contagion, but it is a question of impurity. So infections were polluting. Uncleanness, well, or another word for that would be dirty, was what needed to be addressed here. So all of this has to do with this, be holy as the Lord is holy. And therefore, they set up a lot of what we would call purity rules. If you were rendered in this situation, well, how would you be able to again return to community? Now, I also mention here that, of course, when one thinks about the importance of community, one needs to keep in mind Mediterranean culture. Certainly, this would have been true, even in the Levitical time, that is, when the writers were writing this book, but certainly was very important in the time of Jesus. Namely, Mediterranean culture stressed the importance of community, of being part of a family, being part of a village, being part of society in general. That isn't so much the case for us today. See, when surveys were taken, the idea of the individualist, namely staying pure and holy oneself, when you look at it, only 20% kind of thought this way. 80% thought collectively. That is, you depended on the community for giving meaning to your life. See, this is where I'm going. Individualism say, I don't care what they have to say. I have a sense of purpose of who I am and what I'm going to do. But that really wasn't the major emphasis in the world of Jesus and his contemporaries. So you can see why being part of or being excluded from the community was considered to be very difficult. How does one make a living? Where does one live in this situation? All right, so I give all of that background because certainly it would have been prevalent with some instances in which Jesus is pictured as curing. So, now when one reads the text here from the gospel, let's move from the book of Leviticus now to the actual gospel text. A man approaches Jesus, and he gets angry. Now, it's an interesting thought and very curious that Jesus is pictured as becoming angry. In fact, some interpreters of the scripture in the past are disturbed to think that Jesus could be angry, because we've argued it's not good to have anger, especially if it's, you want to hurt somebody or something else. And so they changed the word from angry to, disturbed, something that, you probably not would get the whole meaning for. But here, the real translation is, he became angry. And, then the question of interpreters is, what is Jesus angry about? Or who is he angry at? Is he angry at the man who is ritually unclean and who dares to come near him and to ask him this question? Is he angry at the manifestation of the demonic hold that what they have on humanity that makes them with this illness? We've talked before about the belief in the demonic and how that spirit can affect people, and that was real thinking also in Jesus' time. Or is Jesus angry that the man has doubts about Jesus' ability to cure? Remember, he says to him, what would you like? Well, if you are able. So is Jesus mad about that? That this man has doubts about his ability to do this? Or is Jesus mad because the man has interrupted Jesus in his teaching? He's talking and teaching others, and this man comes in and says, and starts this. So, as you can see, when it comes to analyzing what exactly is, or who is Jesus exactly angry at, or what is he angry about, why there are these possible interpretations. So I give you all this because as we're looking a little bit at kind of how Mark does these things, we have the opportunity to explore possibilities here. We're not sure, okay? So as you can see, take the one you like. What is Jesus angry at? But, and then, the man says, if you are able. Well, Jesus kind of rejoins that and then says to the man, be clean, be made clean. Now, notice that Jesus here makes the command in what we call the passive voice. Now, you may not be a literature person and say, does it matter? Yes, because by this phrase, be made clean, Jesus acknowledges God as the one who performs the action, and he does so without the use of God's name. So always remember that the power that Jesus has comes from God. And in Mark's story, and this is true to a certain degree in Matthew and Luke's account, Jesus' power is exercised because God gives it to him. Now, in this story, Jesus wills it, but God cleans the leper. So again, it's important to notice, I think, to note that Jesus always attributes whatever healings happen, not to himself, although he is the instrument and medium through whom God acts, but it is really God who in this case, cleans the leprous man. Now, Jesus is pictured as sending him off to the priest, because it is true, and put together what we've been looking at here, in order to be admitted back into the community, you needed actually to get a little bill. We talked about this earlier on, I think, a little bill saying, all right, the man is made clean. But in fact, he would go, the priest would check him out, much, I guess, like a doctor checks you out to see if there's any skin illness or disease, and then send him home and say, come back in a week. We want to make sure that this is truly something that is more permanently happening. So all of this was a process, and I point this out because Jesus here is not challenging the law, that is, that he says it's not important, but he does, and we'll see instances of this in Mark's story as things unfold. And because we have also noticed, and we'll have certain occasions to see, where Mark sees the importance of explaining Jewish customs, but he's certainly aware that Jesus himself followed the traditions of Israel, was loyal to the tradition in which he had been raised. Now, Jesus is also pictured as he sends the man away, says to him, don't say that, don't tell anyone, don't say this to anyone that you have been healed. Now, why is this case? Well, certainly, although they didn't believe in contagion in the sense that the disease was contagious, but if you touched someone who was impure, then didn't you also put yourself in the condition of impurity? So notice that all this impurity has to do with ritualness, with proper washings, with proper restoration to the ability to carry out the traditions of the faith. So Jesus may well be saying, look, just be glad that you are healed, be glad that God has worked for you, but don't spread this around. As we have noticed before, one of the best ways to get messages across to anyone is to tell them it's a secret. Don't tell this to anyone, and you know that's the best way that they're going to spread the message. I'm not saying the best way, but haven't you thought this when you were told this is secret? You got to tell a best friend something, okay? So that there may be again, as I've noticed sometimes in these stories, a little bit of humor, okay? So, this particular miracle now, which we find Jesus doing, is noted by some as a bridge miracle between what has happened on the grand first week that we mentioned a couple of times and moving to the next series of events that will be part of Jesus' ministry. So all of that is, and again, is, all right, a couple other things I wanted to say, but I did want to notice now that today, this time, brings us to the end of the regular season for a while. We will not be back to regular readings from Mark until, after the Easter season. And so we will be missing at that point when we come back. This will be the 10th Sunday of the year, and that will be, by the way, in June. So we will be missing weeks 7, 8, and 9. And in those weeks, just so that you kind of get it, chapter 2 is the material that would be brought to our attention. The 7th Sunday would look at the healing of a paralyzed man. The 8th Sunday would look at the call of Levi and meals that Jesus has with tax collectors and sinners. And then week 9 would have looked at the disciples plucking grain in the field and causing disturbances with the leadership, particularly that Jesus was healing on the Sabbath. I just kind of quickly, so that when we return, now where we are. Of course, next week we begin the season of Lent. We will hear sections from Mark's Gospel that deals with Jesus' temptation, the week after, which deals with transfiguration. Then we will skip to Palm Sunday to hear a section of Mark's Gospel and Mark's Passion narrative. We will one time in the season of Easter, Easter Sunday, by the way, we will get a section from Mark, and then one time in the Easter season from Mark. And my point is, in kind of rounding this up this time, is that we will get scatterings of Mark, but not in the regularity now that we have been accustomed to. In fact, we will notice, and I'll come back to this again, the filler, as is often the case here, is John. So there is an intimate relationship between Mark and John's Gospel. This coming week, then, we begin the season of Lent on Ash Wednesday. This time the section is taken from Matthew and illustrates the importance of the three great Lenten practices, namely prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. We are always kind of aware of that. Again, I thank you very much for being with us as we get ready now to move to a new liturgical year. And if for any reason you have any questions about some of the material that we have discussed or would like further background for analyzing or looking at these things, please do let me know. You can check on our website and send the question in, or mail it if you would like. Certainly would be glad and appreciate to know if these talks are really helpful and how we can improve them. So thank you very much for being part of these sessions, and I hope that none of you take too seriously Leviticus here, because certainly in conclusion, we do strive to be holy as the Lord is holy in both our words and actions. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.